She didn't deny it. She didn't panic. She just looked at me and said, "You're overreacting." That sentence hit harder than the messages I'd just seen. I was standing there, phone shaking in my hand, proof laid out in plain text. Months of flirting, late-night plans, things you don't say to just a friend. I expected excuses, tears, something human. Instead, I got dismissal. "I'm not overreacting," I said, barely recognizing my own voice. She sighed, rolled her eyes slightly, like I was exhausting her. "You're blowing this way out of proportion." It didn't mean anything. That's when the room went cold. Not angry, not loud, just empty. She wasn't ashamed. She wasn't scared. She was annoyed at me, at my reaction, as if discovering her affair was an inconvenience, not a betrayal. I realized in that moment that the marriage wasn't ending because she cheated. It was ending because she could look me in the eye, minimize my pain, and feel absolutely nothing about it. And somehow, I was the problem for caring at all. Before the cheating, I thought our marriage was solid. Not perfect, but steady in a way that made me feel safe. We had routines that felt like proof of commitment. Morning coffee together, shared weekends, inside jokes that had built up over years. I believed we were moving forward, even if life had gotten quieter. We didn't fight much, which I took as a good sign. Disagreements were rare, and when they did happen, we brushed them aside quickly. I told myself that meant we were mature, that we knew how to keep the peace. I didn't see how often keeping the peace meant not talking about what actually mattered. Loyalty was never discussed because I assumed it was understood. Marriage, to me, meant choosing each other even when things felt dull or difficult. I never imagined I'd have to justify why faithfulness mattered. Looking back now, I see how one-sided that belief was. I was protecting a version of the marriage she had already stopped investing in. The changes were subtle enough that I convinced myself they meant nothing. She became more protective of her phone, keeping it face down, stepping away to answer messages. If I asked who she was talking to, she'd say, "Just work," and I didn't push. I told myself trust meant not questioning every little thing. She started coming home later, always with reasonable explanations. A longer meeting, traffic, a coworker needing to talk. None of it sounded suspicious on its own. Together, it formed a pattern I didn't want to see. I chose comfort over confrontation. Emotionally, she pulled back in ways I couldn't quite name at the time. Less eye contact, shorter conversations. When I tried to connect, she seemed distracted, impatient, like I was interrupting something more important. I assumed she was stressed. I offered support instead of asking hard questions. The biggest change was how often I doubted myself. Every uneasy feeling was quickly buried under logic and excuses. I ignored those signals because acknowledging them would have meant admitting something was wrong, and I wasn't ready for that yet. There were clear red flags, and I saw every one of them. I just refused to label them for what they were. Her story stopped lining up. Small details changed depending on when I asked. A dinner with coworkers turned into drinks. Drinks turned into, I don't remember exactly. When I noticed, she said I was being paranoid. She grew defensive over harmless questions. If I asked where she was or who she was with, her tone shifted immediately. Suddenly, I was monitoring her. "Why do you need to know everything?" she'd ask, turning basic transparency into a character flaw. I apologized more than once just for asking. There were nights she came home emotionally distant, almost irritated by my presence. Instead of wondering why, I worked harder to be pleasant, to be understanding. I thought love meant absorbing discomfort without complaint. The biggest red flag was how often I explained her behavior to myself. I minimized, rationalized, and reframed everything so I wouldn't have to face the truth. Every excuse bought me temporary peace and pushed me further away from reality. The first moment something truly felt wrong didn't come from evidence. It came from her words. We were talking about a couple we knew who were getting divorced after an affair. I made an offhand comment about how cheating destroys trust. She looked at me and said, "People make way too big of a deal out of it." I laughed at first, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. When I asked what she meant, she shrugged and said, "It's not always that deep. Sometimes it just happens." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong in our marriage. Loyalty had never been up for debate between us. Hearing her dismiss it so casually made my stomach tighten. That night, lying next to her, I felt unsettled in a way I couldn't explain. Nothing had happened yet that I could point to, But something had shifted. I remember staring at the ceiling, telling myself I was reading too much into it, while a quiet voice in my head kept whispering that I wasn't. Her language started changing in ways that were easy to miss, but impossible to ignore once I noticed them. She stopped speaking emotionally and started speaking strategically. Feelings were replaced with concepts. Commitment became expectations. Promises became assumptions. When I talked about us, she talked about herself. I feel like I need space. I'm just trying to be honest with myself. If I mentioned how something hurt me, she didn't respond with concern. She analyzed it. Told me I was projecting. Said I was attaching meaning where there was none. The word loyalty disappeared entirely. Instead, she used phrases like freedom and personal growth. If I questioned that shift, she'd sigh and say I was being dramatic, that I was stuck in outdated ideas about marriage. What unsettled me most was how calm she was while doing it. No anger, no emotion, just controlled, deliberate language that made me feel irrational for wanting reassurance. Slowly, her words reframed betrayal as self-discovery and made my discomfort sound like a flaw I needed to fix. The emotional distance didn't appear after the affair. It was already there, growing quietly while I tried to ignore it. She stopped opening up to me. Conversations stayed on the surface. When I asked how she was really feeling, she'd say, "I'm fine," and shut it down. We spent more time together physically, yet less connected than ever. She was always somewhere else mentally, smiling at her phone, laughing at things I wasn't part of. When I tried to pull her closer, she accused me of being needy. When I gave her space, she seemed relieved. Intimacy lost its warmth. It felt scheduled, rushed, almost transactional. I kept telling myself this was normal, that long marriages go through phases like this. But deep down, I felt the absence. You can sense when someone is no longer emotionally choosing you. By the time the affair happened, she had already withdrawn her presence, her curiosity, and her empathy. The cheating didn't create the distance. It simply filled the space that emotional detachment had already made. The lies were rarely big enough to expose themselves. That was the problem. They lived in the details, the kind you only notice when you're paying attention. A story that changed slightly. A timeline that didn't quite fit. A reason that sounded rehearsed. She'd say she was out with coworkers, then later mention something that couldn't have happened there. When I asked for clarification, she corrected herself smoothly, without hesitation. No panic, no confusion, just confidence. Like someone who had practiced the version she wanted me to believe. She began explaining things before I even questioned them. Long justifications for simple plans. Too many details delivered too quickly. It felt unnatural, but every time I noticed, I talked myself out of it. I didn't want to be the suspicious husband. What made it harder was how she framed my doubt. "Why don't you trust me?" she'd ask, turning my confusion into betrayal. And slowly, I started doubting myself more than I doubted her, even as the lies continued not to add up. I didn't catch her in the act. There was no dramatic confession or accidental slip. I found out in the quietest way possible, and that somehow made it worse. I was alone, scrolling through her tablet, not searching for anything specific. A message notification popped up from a name I didn't recognize. The tone of it made my stomach drop instantly. Too familiar. Too intimate. Not something you send casually. I opened it. Then another. Then I scrolled back further than I wanted to. Weeks of messages. Flirting that slowly turned explicit. Jokes, plans, late-night conversations that felt alive in a way our marriage hadn't in a long time. No single message said, "We're having an affair," but together they said everything. What hurt most wasn't the sexual content. It was how engaged she sounded. Curious, present, emotionally invested. A version of her I hadn't seen directed at me in months. I sat there in silence, numb, realizing this wasn't an accident or a lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, a choice, made repeatedly, while I was still believing in a marriage she had already stepped out of. I confronted her that night. No build-up, no rehearsed speech. I just said his name and waited. I thought there would be shock, denial, something, anything that suggested she hadn't expected this moment. She barely reacted. She looked at me, then at the phone in my hand, and let out a slow breath. "Okay," she said. "Not what are you talking about? Not how did you know, just okay." Like I'd finally caught up to a conversation she'd already finished having with herself. I asked her if it was true. She nodded. I asked how long. She shrugged. "Does it matter?" That answer hit harder than a confession ever could. I was still operating in pain. She was already detached from it. When I asked why, she didn't apologize. She said, "You're overreacting. It wasn't that serious. No urgency. No guilt. Just dismissal." That's when I understood this wasn't going to turn into a fight or a plea for forgiveness. This was her calmly standing in the aftermath, telling me my reaction was the problem, not what she'd done. She didn't just refuse to apologize, she rejected the entire idea that she should feel guilty. When I asked her if she felt any remorse at all, she looked genuinely confused by the question, like I was asking something unreasonable. "I don't feel bad," she said, "and I'm not going to fake it just to make you feel better." She explained it calmly, almost intellectually. Said guilt was pointless. Said dragging herself through shame wouldn't change anything. Said I was asking her to perform emotions she didn't have. Every word landed heavier than the last, because none of them carried empathy. When I told her how much it hurt, she shook her head and said I was centering myself too much, that I was turning her experience into my trauma. Somehow, my pain became evidence of my selfishness. There was no acknowledgement of the damage. No responsibility, just a firm refusal to step into the mess she created. In that moment, I understood something brutal. She hadn't just moved on from the affair. She had moved on from caring how it affected me at all. After that, everything inside me gave way at once. Not in a dramatic breakdown. No yelling, no tears on the floor, but in a quiet, total collapse. I felt hollow, like something essential had been drained out of me. My chest tightened and my thoughts slowed. I remember staring at a spot on the wall, trying to focus, trying to stay present, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad in a clear way. I was empty, numb. She sat there across from me, watching it happen, unmoved. No instinct to comfort me. No reach across the space between us. That absence hurt more than any words she'd said. It confirmed what I'd been resisting. I was alone in this marriage. I had spent so long questioning my instincts, minimizing my feelings, telling myself I was being unfair. And in one conversation, all of that shattered. The collapse wasn't just emotional. It was the death of the belief that we were still on the same side. The decision didn't arrive with clarity at first. It came as exhaustion. I realized I had been chasing something all night. An apology, a crack in her certainty, any sign that she cared. And it finally hit me that nothing I said would produce that. I saw how one-sided it had been for a long time. Me explaining, me waiting, me trying to translate my pain into something she might understand. You can't reason someone into empathy. You can't negotiate loyalty after it's already been dismissed. So I stopped. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten or beg. I just went quiet. Not in anger, but in acceptance. The kind that hurts, but also frees you. In that moment, I chose to stop chasing someone who had already walked away emotionally. I didn't feel strong. I felt empty. But beneath that emptiness was the beginning of something new, self-respect. After that night, the space between us stopped feeling temporary. It settled in, solid and unmistakable. We moved around each other like roommates who knew the lease was ending. Conversations became brief and functional. No arguments, no emotion, just distance. I stopped asking where she was going. Stopped checking my phone for replies. Not because I trusted her, but because I no longer needed answers. Detachment replaced anxiety. What once consumed my thoughts now felt strangely irrelevant. She noticed the shift. Not with fear, but with confusion. When I stopped reacting, stopped trying to connect, it disrupted the balance she was used to. My indifference unsettled her more than anger ever had. Distance gave me clarity. Without constant emotional noise, the truth was simple. A relationship without remorse, loyalty, or empathy is already over. We were still under the same roof, but emotionally, I had already left. Walking away didn't start with me leaving the house. It started with me finally listening to what she had been telling me all along. When someone cheats and shows no guilt, when they dismiss your pain and tell you you're overreacting, that's not confusion, that's honesty. It's who they are. I wasted too much time believing explanations mattered. They don't. Remorse does. Empathy does. Loyalty does. Without them, love is just a label people use when it benefits them. A marriage without those things is already empty, even if it still exists on paper. If someone betrays you and then minimizes it, believe them the first time. Don't argue your worth. Don't beg someone to care. Don't wait for guilt that will never come. Being told you're overreacting after betrayal is emotional abandonment. Cheating hurts, but cheating without guilt and dismissing your pain like it's nothing is the final betrayal.